These sinister spells shall sap the strength from the mightiest monsters and the hardiest heroes.
Today we're looking at 7 deadly debuffs for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Greetings, witches and warlocks. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin. And
we are the Dungeon Dudes.
And today we're taking a look at 7 deadly debuff spells in Dungeons & Dragons.
Now, debuffs are a pretty unique and narrow category of spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. They're actually quite rare, but there's a few traits that distinguish a debuff spell from, say, a control spell, or a damage-dealing spell, or a utility spell that we're going to look at in detail today.
When we talk about debuff spells, we're looking at spells that have a numerical decrease to your enemy's ability checks or stats, or give you advantage against them, or them disadvantage against you.
In previous editions, such as 3rd edition and 4th edition, these spells, with their stacking penalties, would cause a lot of math and bookkeeping to happen at the table, particularly in combat. And so they become very rare as a result. In addition, the concentration mechanic really dials back the number of effects that can be happening at the same time in a combat encounter, and makes spellcasters often have to choose between spells which deal ongoing damage, spells which incapacitate or stun or control their foes or create a battlefield control effect, and spells which cause debuffs. For example, a foe incapacitated by hypnotic pattern automatically snaps out of the effect if they take any damage.
On the other hand, debuff spells are things that are going to allow you to continue to attack your enemies while giving them a disadvantage or some sort of penalty in that combat.
This is a great way to reduce the threat a foe represents while you're beating them down, or even make it easier to hit or damage that foe in the first place.
So without further ado, this is our list of 7 deadly debuff spells that you can take in your game.
We haven't ranked these spells in any particular order. We're just going to go through them by their spell level in alphabetical order. We've just picked some of our favorites, and if you have a different opinion, if we've omitted one of your favorites, or perhaps you don't think our choices are the best ones, let us know in the comments below.
So with that, let's get casting. The first spell that we are going to talk about today is Bane.
Gotham's Reckoning. Bane is a first-level enchantment spell, which you can find on page 216 of your player's handbook. It's available to bards, clerics, Oath of Vengeance paladins, and warlocks can also pick this up by taking the Thief of 5 Fates invocation.
When you cast Bane, you can target up to 3 enemies, and they must make a charisma saving throw. If they fail for the next minute and your concentration, they have to roll a d4 every time that they make an attack roll or saving throw, and decrease that number from their roll.
Now, Bane is a first-level concentration spell, and it's not often a popular choice, but we do list it because Bane is one of the few ways in the entire game that you can create a penalty to an enemy's saving throws. And that makes it pretty unique as a debuff spell, especially when you need to support the spellcasters in your party.
When your spellcasters are dishing out those spells that require saving throws at your table, it actually can be endlessly helpful to have that extra d4 subtracted from your enemy's rolls to try to save, and can really turn the tides of battle for you.
It does require a little bit of teamwork to make these things stick, and it's no guarantee, but if the wizard or sorcerer or druid in your party has a really important spell effect that you need to land, having the bard or cleric or paladin cast Bane as a setup can be really, really successful. One of the other great things about Bane is that the effect lasts as long as your concentration does, so there's no way for the creatures to wiggle out of the spell unless they break your concentration or dispel it. Unfortunately, because Bane does require your own concentration and immediately ends if you cast another spell that requires concentration, you can't use Bane to impose a penalty for one of your own concentration spells, because Bane ends the moment you start casting that spell. But you can use it for your other spells like Fireball or other one-shot spells that don't require concentration that still require a saving throw.
The next spell that we're going to talk about today is one of my favorite spells in the whole game, actually, and that's Faerie Fire.
Faerie Fire is a first level evocation spell, and it's available to bards and druids, but also warlocks under the Pact of the Archfey, and light domain clerics gain access to it. You can find it on page 239 of your player's handbook.
When you cast Faerie Fire, it creates a 20-foot cube, and any enemy within that area must make a dexterity saving throw. If they fail, they're illuminated in light, your choice between blue, green, or obviously violet, which is my go-to choice. And those creatures, if they were invisible, are now visible to you. Finally, any attack roll against those creatures has advantage as long as the attacker can see the target.
Now, I love Faerie Fire. I like to think of it as a marker light type spell. It's a great spell for identifying priority targets. And as a first level spell that shuts down invisibility, it's an indispensable utility tool.
And also, they don't get additional saving throws against it. So the entire time you're concentrating on it, they're just illuminated and your whole party can just wail on them with advantage.
It is one of the easiest and most direct ways to generate party-wide advantage on attack rolls against a group of enemies. It means that the party bard can lay down the Faerie Fire while the cleric brings Bane or Bless. So you get this great teamwork combination happening.
I find Faerie Fire to be one of those spells that if I am playing a class that has the option to take it, I don't even consider other spells first. Faerie Fire is the first one that I take because for me it's just been so reliable to improve our chances in combat in any situation.
Yeah, of course, there are going to be foes with high dexterity saving throws that are going to pretty easily avoid it. But against those slow attackers like fighters in plate mail and dragons that don't have very good dexterity saving throws but have very high armor class, this is an awesome option, particularly if you have fighters or rangers in your party that love using things like Sharpshooter and Great Weapon Master. They're going to be your best friend if you cast Faerie Fire on their target.
Yeah. So if you can take Faerie Fire, you should take Faerie Fire. The next spell we're going to talk about is the legendary Hex.
Now, Hex is actually a little bit out of place in this episode because it is more of a personal buff spell for warlocks rather than being a straight-up debuff. And it has a component to it that trips up many players, because when you hex your target, you also get to choose one ability score, and you impose disadvantage on ability checks involving that ability score. I've seen many players think that you impose disadvantage on saving throws, and Hex does not do that.
That's a common mistake, and I mean, if it did do that, that would be much more
jaw-droppingly amazing if it did that.
Yeah. But no, it's on ability checks. But you can still nullify some of the abilities of your enemy by doing this, and that can still have a nice impact in battle. Of course, Hex is well known for giving your warlock more damage as they pummel that enemy, usually with Eldritch Blast or something like that. But the reason why it's making our list of debuff spells is for that little added part where you actually get to give them disadvantage on those ability checks.
Ability checks come up in combat in all sorts of obscure ways. They can come up in places such as creatures having to make investigation checks against illusion spells cast by another party. You can impose disadvantage on that creature's ability to escape a grapple or a grab, or break out of a web spell by giving them disadvantage on their dexterity or strength ability checks. In fact, if you can get Hex out before the battle starts, you might be able to impose disadvantage on an enemy's initiative check, because initiative is technically an ability check.
Cool. We're going to throw in a little bonus spell here because we would be remiss not to mention Bestow Curse.
Bestow Curse is a third-level necromancy spell, and it's available to bards, clerics, wizards, as well as warlocks via an Eldritch Invocation, as well as Oathbreaker and Oath of Conquest paladins. You can find it on page 218 of your player's handbook.
Now, unlike Hex, which is only available to warlocks, this one definitely has a much larger range of people who could take it, which is why we're mentioning it today.
And one of the really unique things about Bestow Curse is that if the target does fail its wisdom saving throw, there's a pretty wide list of debuffs that you can impose onto it, including, like Hex, disadvantage on ability checks as well as saving throws made with that particular ability's score. So if you are looking for your ongoing source of disadvantage on a saving throw, Bestow Curse is going to give it to you, but you're going to have to make it stick in the first place.
You can also use Bestow Curse similar to an upgraded Hex, because it will allow you to do additional damage as well.
Now, one of the unique things about Bestow Curse, and why it deserves a special mention in this list, is that when Bestow Curse is cast using a higher level spell slot, its duration is altered from 10 minutes to an hour, ultimately getting up to indefinitely if you cast it using a 9th level spell slot. What's more, when you cast Bestow Curse using a spell slot of 5th level or higher, it no longer requires concentration, meaning that Bestow Curse is a sneaky way to stack debuffs on top of a single target, because it does bypass that concentration mechanic when you use a higher level spell slot for it.
The next spell that we are going to talk about today is Heat Metal.
Heat Metal is a 2nd level transmutation spell, which you can find on page 250 of your player's handbook. It's available to bards, druids, and forge domain clerics. Bards, druids, and clerics are just bringing those debuffs.
Yeah, that's really their big thing in combat, seems to be the buffs and debuffs. That's kind of their role in the party.
You can cast Heat Metal using your action, and it lasts for up to 1 minute while requiring your concentration. When you cast it, you choose one object made of metal that you can see, and you cause it to glow red hot for the duration of the spell. Any creature in physical contact with that object automatically takes 2d8 damage. And on consecutive turns, you can use a bonus action on your turn to cause this 2d8 fire damage to happen again.
There's no save against that damage. That's kind of the big deal here, is that if you have an enemy who is wearing plate mail and you heat that metal up, unless they're spending the entire combat disrobing, they're taking that damage consistently.
Heat Metal does include a saving throw to it, but it's a little bit tricky in the way that it's implemented, and it often works in your favor. A creature that's holding the object that you have heated up has to make a Constitution saving throw whenever it takes the damage from Heat Metal, or it must drop the object. If, on the other hand, the creature succeeds the saving throw, or it doesn't drop the object, either because it can't, because it's wearing it, or because it made the saving throw, it then has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks as long as it continues to hold or wear that object. This is incredible.
Yeah, that's a permanent debuff for almost the whole battle in a lot of situations.
It is a great way to just defang that plate armored fighter that is charging at you, because as long as they're wearing that plate mail, chain mail, whatever metal armor they have on, it's heated up, and if they don't take it off and they continue to take damage from Heat Metal, they've got disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks.
The great thing about Heat Metal is there's a lot of creative solutions if you have some good players that can work together to add metal into the combat. In one instance, I was playing a bard who had a crossbow and we were fighting treants. So on my first turn, I fired a bolt into a treant, and on my next turn, I cast Heat Metal on that bolt. You could also do things like wrap an enemy in chains and then cast Heat Metal on the chains. There's so many metal objects lying around in most situations that Heat Metal can have a lot of creative uses.
I've also seen instances where players have tried to use Heat Metal on the fighter's sword to get extra fire damage on attacks. The spell really isn't set up to use it in that way because the damage happens when you use your bonus action on your turn. But throwing that sword into somebody, stabbing it into them, or even finding some other metal piece on the creature. For example, Heat Metal can work on magical objects. So if an enemy is wearing a magic ring or a magical amulet, that could be the target. In which case, now that enemy might have a very difficult choice. Are you going to throw off your magic ring, which is giving you a defensive benefit? Take off that magical amulet, because that's going to continue to cause you damage, even though it's very easy to take those objects off.
Really useful spell, really creative spell. Excellent option. The next spell that we're going to talk about today is Slow.
Slow is a 3rd level transmutation spell available to sorcerers, wizards, order domain clerics, as well as Circle of the Land druids associated with the Arctic regions, and you can find it on page 277 of your player's handbook. I believe it's also available to warlocks via the Mire the Mind invocation. Slow has a 120-foot range, targets a cube within the range, and then within that cube, you choose 6 creatures that have to make wisdom saving throws. So it's a very easy to target spell because your allies can be in that area, but then you just omit them from the 6 that you choose.
That's also a really good range. 120-foot range and a 40-foot cube, that's an excellent amount of range on that spell. You can target anywhere on the battlefield most of the time.
The creatures make a wisdom saving throw, or they are affected by the slow spell for the duration, although they do get to repeat the saving throw at the end of each of their turns, escaping the effect on a successful saving throw.
So there are a whole bunch of things that come into play when a creature is affected by slow. First of all, its movement speed is cut in half, and it gets a -2 to its AC and its dexterity saving throws.
One of the few spells that has a flat minus penalty to anything, including, again, a rare penalty to saving throws.
I also think the -2 to AC is super helpful for just hitting heavy armored targets.
This is one of the only spells in the game with just a flat numerical penalty to AC and saving throw.
On top of that, you can't take reactions, and you can either do an action or a bonus action on your turn, but not both.
In addition, even if you have spells or abilities or magic items that allow you to make more than one attack as your action, you can only ever make one. So that 5-headed Hydra or the demon with 8 arms, one attack, regardless of all those extra limbs.
It also has a really big effect on spellcasters, doesn't it?
It does, because if a spellcaster is afflicted by slow, when they cast a spell, they have to roll a d20. On an 11 or higher, the spell doesn't take effect that turn, and instead the spellcaster must use their action on their next turn to finish casting the spell. And if they don't do that, the spell is just completely wasted.
That's a lot of stuff that can really help you out in combat. The flat -2, the limited actions that they can take, affecting spellcasters so that it sometimes takes them 2 rounds to cast a spell. When all of your enemies are moving in slow motion, you can run circles around them and just stab them as much as you want while they're trying to slowly move into a position to try to fight back.
Slow is an amazing spell. The conditions that it imposes are completely debilitating for those that are suffering under its effects. The only saving grace for them is that they do get an opportunity to escape from it at the end of each turn with another wisdom saving throw. And wisdom saving throws tend to be a pretty strong one for the creatures that have good ones, but a pretty weak one for the creatures that have bad ones. So it can be a little swingy in that respect.
The hardest part for slow is that it is a 3rd level spell. And in my opinion, my 3rd level spell slots are the hardest for me to choose because there are so many good 3rd level spells. So slow does have a bit of a problem here where choosing it over some of your other options can be a little tough.
This is because, while slow imposes a penalty to virtually everything a creature wants to do, in 3rd level spells there are alternatives that will basically stop the creatures from doing that thing entirely. You might be able to debilitate a caster from getting a spell off with slow, but you could also just counterspell them. You might be able to prevent a creature from making 5 multi-attacks, but it can't make any attacks at all if it's been incapacitated by Hypnotic Pattern.
Which is also a wisdom saving throw.
The key decision point on whether you're going to use Counterspell or Hypnotic Pattern or slow is really going to come down to whether you need to reduce the amount of threat that a monster imposes while you're trying to kill them, or whether you want to take them out of the fight entirely with another 3rd level spell. Overall, I'm a little biased. I generally gravitate towards Hypnotic Pattern over slow. Again, they both require concentration, so it's difficult to combine them at the same time. The other thing is that slow, because of its wisdom saving throws, even though it's an amazing debuff, you're never going to get slow to work against the boss or a legendary monster because they're definitely going to use their legendary resistance against the spell. it's just too much of a debuff to endure if you are the big bad evil guy. They're almost certainly going to have a get out of jail free card for that. I think slow is the clearest example of the difficult decision that the concentration mechanic gives you.
It's a tough choice.
Yeah, slow is just a tough choice. It's one of those spells that offers such an amazing and beautiful effect, but because of the concentration mechanic and the fact that they get the wisdom saving throw to escape the effect, and ultimately because none of the effects actually completely shut down the creature, you have to gauge really carefully whether or not it is the best choice for the encounter.
The next spell we're going to be talking about is Synaptic Static, which was introduced in Xanathar's Guide to Everything.
You can find it on page 167 of that book, and it's available to bards, wizards, warlocks, and sorcerers. I love this spell so much.
One thing I love about a lot of the spells in Xanathar's is it targets intelligence. They added a lot of spells that target intelligence, and I think that that is something that was missing, and Synaptic Static is kind of the first one that stuck out to me. It's a good spell to target intelligence.
We like to call Synaptic Static the Psychic Fireball. Although it has a slightly shorter range than the true Fireball spell, it still affects the same area, a 20-foot radius sphere. And it does the same amount of damage as Fireball, but it's 8d6 psychic damage. It is a 5th level enchantment spell, so your damage for the spell slot is not as good. But the combination of the psychic damage over fire damage, the intelligence saving throw, and the extra nasty debuff they get as a parting gift makes this a truly awesome spell.
Targets who fail their saving throw take all the damage and take a 1d6 penalty to their attack rolls, their ability checks, and constitution saving throws to maintain concentration on spells.
They can make an intelligence saving throw at the end of their turns to remove the debuff, but Synaptic Static doesn't require your concentration to maintain this, meaning that each individual enemy has to track whether or not they're still brain scrambled by the Synaptic Static or not. This is just such a Swiss Army knife of the spell. You've got awesome damage, a concentration-free debuff, and a wide range of classes that can access it, including bards and warlocks.
Not only that, but psychic damage versus the Fireball fire damage. Like, psychic damage is one of the least resisted damages that you can have. So you're going to mess people up with this spell. I've seen this spell end combat encounters against groups of lower level creatures.
Yeah.
It's just, it messes them up, and then they're useless. If they survive the damage, they're pretty useless afterwards.
And even against higher level creatures where fire resistance becomes really, really common, that 5th level Fireball spell isn't doing anything to a red dragon, but Synaptic Static is really going to give them a bad day.
The last spell we're going to be talking about today is Contagion, which did have an errata released for it, which kind of changes the way it works a little bit, and we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, you can find Contagion on page 227 of your player's handbook, but if you have an earlier printing of the player's handbook, you pretty much need to disregard most of what it says and go to the errata on the Wizards of the Coast website and reread how it's changed, because it's really different now. Contagion is a 5th level necromancy spell. It's available to clerics, druids, warlocks of the Undying patron, as well as Oathbreaker paladins. When you cast Contagion, you make a melee spell attack against a target within your reach, and if you hit, the target is now poisoned. At the end of each of their turns, the target can make a Constitution saving throw. If they're successful, you mark it off. And if they fail, you also mark it off. If the target succeeds their saving throw 3 times, the spell ends. But if they fail 3 times, they're then afflicted with a much worse disease that now lasts for a duration of 7 days. Whether or not the target is afflicted with the disease is actually completely inconsequential to what makes Contagion a great spell now.
What's awesome about this is even if they succeed on those 3 saving throws, this still means that they are instantly poisoned for at least 3 rounds.
And while they're poisoned, they have disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks. Poisoned is a pretty commonly resisted condition. It's not going to work against undead creatures and many creatures like devils. But against everything else, Contagion offers a pretty inescapable source of disadvantage to a creature's attack rolls.
Yeah, so really, if you're casting Contagion with the hopes of giving them this horrible disease, that shouldn't be where your focus is. You're looking at 3 to 6 rounds of disadvantage on attack rolls that you're just throwing at that enemy.
Yep.
If you have a legendary monster in front of you, giving them that disadvantage and forcing them to maybe blow their legendary resistances to try to get out of the horrible effects that will happen if they fail their rolls against Contagion, this is a great use of this spell against a legendary creature.
Furthermore, it doesn't require concentration. Again, giving it that really key niche of a debuff spell that will last a long time. This debuff will stick around, even against a legendary creature or a big bad with awesome saving throws, because all you have to do is land that initial hit. And landing an attack roll is way easier than getting a saving throw to stick, because in general, monsters have so many ways to boost up their saving throws to automatically resist spells, but they don't have a lot of ways to increase their AC or avoid an attack that hits. So Contagion, this is that perfect opportunity to use your luck point, get your advantage on the attack roll, get that big bonus, stick it, and now that dragon is going to be really way less dangerous, because blanket disadvantage on all your attack rolls for an entire combat encounter, because most combat's going to last 3 to 6 rounds anyways. Even if they have legendary resistance, it doesn't go away. It stays, which makes it great.
So this has been a look at 7 deadly debuff spells in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. If you have some favorite debuff spells that we didn't talk about in this episode, let us know about that in the comments below.
And if you're enjoying our show and want to learn how you can support the channel, consider becoming a patron of our work. You can find out how by following the links in the description below.
If you want to see Monty and myself playing D&D, you can check out our live play Dungeons of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. If you want to catch up with previous episodes, we have a playlist of those right up over here.
And we've got a whole playlist of all the other episodes where we've been discussing the spells in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
in the dungeon.